David.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before we get going, I'd just like to have a little bit of feedback from the live audience just to make sure that the sound and the vision is reaching you correctly. So if we could have a bit of confirmation on the chat, that would be terrific. Have we got some confirmation on this?
Great.
Anybody? Just having trouble opening the chat line.
There we go.
Yes, we got it.
Okay, perfect. Ladies and gentlemen, can I first of all say what a pleasure it is for all of us to be back in something that resembles the Lloyd's of London international insurance marketplace once again. Lloyd's opened its doors on Tuesday, and while there were few people present, it was a joy just to have that market that we all seek to work with, to serve the customers that we all know so well, to have it up and trading again. I was very upset back in March when the lutein bell was rung once for bad news to close down the market, and it is such a joy and pleasure to be back. And welcome back, ladies, gentlemen, from all parts of the world. Obviously from the London insurance market, but also from the fine art market, from the maritime world. And we have attendees from several continents, and it is a joy to be working with you all. So I am very excited about the discussion that we're going to have this afternoon, because it actually combines two of the areas that I have some knowledge of, and it combines two highly technical and highly specialist areas where there can be some friction or even conflict between one side of that fence and the other. But of course, I'm not alone. I have with me the brilliant panelists who are going to be helping us this afternoon. So I'm going to first of all introduce Manoj Phatak. He is the CEO at ArtRatio. Now, ArtRatio are people who work extremely hard in the management of risk to fine art. They are specifically a manufacturer of Smartglass vitrines, which protect fine art from light, damage, and many other things. And it's not just fine art, to be sure. They also protect many other luxurious objects. And this is an operation which is so important in the marine environment, where, as we will discuss, the risk factor can be higher. So Manoj, this is going to be very interesting. Your experience in displaying and conservation and security will be most valuable. Now, changing the subject almost, I would also like to introduce Paul Lindahl. Now, Paul is the president and CEO of Arius Technology. Arius Technology are an organization which is involved in the authentication and sometimes the creation of art. They work obviously with preservation and conservation, but they also have the ability to recreate works of art to an extremely high standard. And they, of course, with that expertise, which Paul will be discussing further, Paul is able to authenticate works of art, but also to work in terms of damage and pre-existing damage and restoration of existing fine art. He's terribly important. It's a very interesting company, and they've worked closely with Tate Britain. They've worked with the National Gallery of Canada, and they have enormous background and expertise in conservation and restoration. Now, last and not least, I would like to introduce Pandora Matherlees. Some of you will be familiar with Pandora. She is a regular attendee, as indeed Paul is, at the famous International Fine Art and Specie Insurance Conference, which tragically has been called off this year. And she is an art historian with 30 years. She started very young, operating in the art and cultural and luxury industries. She has also a particular interest in superyachts and how art in that environment can be conservated, appreciated, and protected where necessary. And Pandora is, of course, also very keen on training people who are in the art world, people who are in the marine world, people in the very high and high net worth world, and naturally people in the insurance world, so that they can operate in these slightly diverse worlds, so that we all understand one another. It saves an awful lot of grief. To introduce myself, I'm David Brackenbury. I'm the managing director of David Brackenbury Associates, which is a small consultancy which was set up in 2006, and we represent people in the expert world. En français, les experts. So it might be loss adjusters, it might be surveyors, it might be lawyers, it might be conservators or art mediators, or indeed it might be on the marine side. It is interesting that I've been asked to moderate this because my experience does indeed include Specie and fine arts. I was Specie Claims Director at Jardine Lloyd Thompson, and then later at HSBC Insurance Brokers, and until I set up in 2006. But also, I spent much of my childhood sailing in a small yacht around Northwest Europe. I spent 1983 to 1986 sailing around the world in a rather larger, rather attractive 48-foot ketch, but ladies and gentlemen, no super yacht to be sure. And I was also for 14 years in the Royal Naval Reserve, and was zooming around in minesweepers, which are considerably larger, but sadly, once again, not super yachts. So that's the panel. That's who I am. We will also looking at the screen that we have. You are invited to make your inquiry about a forthcoming super yachts and fine art training event, and you should have a logo on your screens. Please feel free to ask a question, and please feel free, if somebody does ask a question, to upvote it or downvote it accordingly, depending upon the question. And then we will try to make sure that they are fired to the relevant panelist. There is a chat function, which I understand some of you have already discovered. And lastly, there are a number of polls on the right, in which you can vote to drop your opinions. But anyway, that's the introduction, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, and it is such a joy to be back in the market. So, we now actually come down to the nitty-gritty. Now, we all know about super yachts, don't we? We see these glorious vessels, and they're often moored up in Monte Carlo or Puerto Banús or wherever it may be, or in the West Indies and so forth. And they are absolutely lovely. They have got wonderful appointments, and as you see here, you've got the lovely outdoor little mini terrace, and you have the sofa and the furniture indoors, inside, and you notice the work that is in the background. Well, it is, for the record, a Fontana painting. It's worth several tens of millions of pounds, and it is standing there. One of the problems that we have is the environment in which fine art is stored and displayed on board these vessels. So I'm now going to open it up to the panel. So Manoj, good afternoon to you. And I'm just wondering what your views are about the marine environment which poses, in your view, the greatest threat to artworks.
So thank you, David, and good afternoon, good morning to everybody. To answer your question, in the marine environment, clearly the biggest factor would be ultraviolet or UV. And we find that UV is in fact stronger as you approach the equator, simply because there is a smaller volume of air which can absorb the UV as it comes down from the sun. That can impact any marine vessel, and of course any artworks which are sitting on that vessel. We also see that sea foam reflects about a quarter of that UV back up. So we have to worry not only about the UV coming down, but the UV being reflected from the sea back towards the boat and potentially back towards the artworks. Now, we should distinguish between UV B and UV A radiation. So UVB gives us a suntan, can be highly dangerous, but it is thankfully blocked by normal float glass. That's not the case for UVA. Okay, so unless it's been specially filtered. So UV is definitely the big, most important factor. But about half of the energy coming from the sun is actually infrared, in other words, heat. And this is what causes extreme temperatures. And we learned from the British Standards document, PAS 198, that the reaction rates can double with each 5 degrees C rise in temperature. Now, this can result in desiccation on works of art, such as works on paper, for example. And as the temperature goes up, correspondingly, the humidity then, relative humidity, goes down because they're inversely proportional. And so for every 2 degrees C rise, we actually see a lowering of about 6% on the relative humidity on the item's surface. And this can result in flaking and delamination. And so not to forget also the saline air factor with the fact that we have aerosol particles. These are microscopic organic and inorganic particles coming from the sea, and they can be carried by the wind, of course. They can carry pollutants and they can damage the art. So from the insurance perspective, of course, what's important is to understand what these risks are, where they're coming from, why they exist, and of course, we'll be looking at certain ways solutions to prevent them.
Thank you, Manoj, because of course, I mean, what you highlight several interesting areas here, because certainly when I was at sea, you often find humidity getting onto the metal surfaces of a ship. And whether it be a minesweeper or small boat or a super yacht, it's the same principle. And yet, you're also arguing that temperature rise can reduce the relative humidity and cause a danger. So I guess you're somewhat in trouble either way, or potentially you are.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, Pandora, I wonder if you can add to Manoj's comments again. About the marine, about the threats that might be posed to artworks at sea.
Yes, thank you, David. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. I feel like, in a way, having listened to Manoj, we're in a mini IFASIC ourselves. So it's really good knowledge that we're sharing. And yes, indeed. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that, following on from David's points, super yachts really are now surpassing themselves with each new build in terms of the technology, the capacity, and the interior design, as you can see here. And really, the interiors, by getting bigger, they have more space for the art. And one might think that they're a little bit further removed from the sea, so a little bit more protected. But then when you look at these lovely little sort of sun deck, private sun deck areas, as we saw in the first slide, they really are sort of quite vulnerable. So it is important to be aware of that and look at the protection. So I really categorize these in three key areas. So the sorts of risks that Manoj spoke about, for instance, I would class as a sort of one of the ongoing continual risks, the environmental risks. And along with that are the 10, what we call as art conservators, the 10 agents of deterioration. One of those is the human factor. And I would say that humans, unfortunately, we can't get rid of them, but humans are really the big cause of a lot of damage, often inadvertently, of course. And then we've got pests and other sorts of things. We have risks such as bringing an artwork onto a vessel and taking it into international waters. So it's not exactly the same situation as being on land. And you might actually have a situation where there's a lien on that artwork, or there's not proper title to it by the person that is taking it abroad, or indeed some other export risks, which I will come on to later. So those are ongoing risks. And then I talk about event-based risks. So event-based risks are really things such as new staff coming on board, new artworks coming on board, refits. So when the yacht goes into refit, will the artwork stay on board or will it be taken off? And there are risks with both of those aspects. And then also going in and out of guest mode. So when the owners are on board with their guests or when they're off board, a lot of changes happen at these points that perhaps people don't always realize unless they're deeply in the yachting world. Sea trials is another one. Sea trials are supposed to stress test the yachts. And obviously for that reason, there shouldn't be artwork on board, but there could well be. So I think it has been known. So those are things we have to consider with the event-based risks. And then I talk in my training about unseen hazards. And these are things that we don't often really necessarily acknowledge. But one of the biggest ones is the fact that we have communication issues. So for those that aren't in the super yacht industry, you can have a situation. I mean, I had it about 2 or 3 months ago. Someone asked me about a sculpture going on board and some issues to do with liability. And they basically had someone was in Spain, the interior designer was in England, the yard was in Hamburg, there was an art director somewhere, there was an owner in another location. And you've got all of these people in between the captain and the stew and the actual owner, all of these connecting people, not to mention, you know, his EA or PA who's trying to coordinate this. And so that chain of communication between those people can mean that we don't actually have proper knowledge about what is coming on board. And this has actually happened in many cases where artworks have been nearly lost or destroyed. We had a situation with an Andy Warhol sculpture that was not just left on the dock, it was put into a wheelie bin on the dock. So we do get some really, really bad issues happening. So it's really, really important that people know what is happening. And one of the reasons they don't is this aspect of privacy, which the owners, you know, enjoy and want to continue to impose. And that obviously is important. But as you can see, if people aren't told and they're only told on a need to know basis, you can have all sorts of sort of hidden risks happening. The other aspect I would say, I think all of you in the insurance industry would probably realize that last minute demands by high net worth owners, and we have to think now as a super yacht owner, as art collector, so shift our minds. so often people are asking, and I've worked in art logistics, and I know some art logistics people here, welcome, but you know, the last minute kind of moving of these things means that all the risk assessment can go right out of the window. So I think those are just some of the things, and I just touch really on ignorance of the object, not just of the process, but ignorance of what the object is and what value it has as well. And I think I'll stop there, David, for the moment.
Well, thank you, Pandora. I mean, of course, you raised so many very interesting points here with the actual medium of the artwork concerned, and also when you consider the actual vessel in which it's placed. And you're quite right. I mean, these vessels are absolutely amazing. I have had the privilege of being on board the occasional super yacht on visits in Monte Carlo and places like that, and they are absolutely fabulous. They have museum quality atmospheres inside the vessel, but of course, as with anything at sea, things can break, so one always has to be cautious of that. And the other thing I think that you pointed out, and you're absolutely right, Pandora, is communication, because you are combining three worlds, aren't you? You're combining the fine art world and all that goes with that, all the careful work and restoration and conservation and protection of fine art, and indeed the transit of fine art. Remember, you have to get this object, this precious object, onto a large vessel somewhere, and maybe take it off a large vessel. So it isn't just the stay risk. It's not just for transit. It's not just for static risk. It can be the transit as well. And then all the hazards that anything that goes to sea might be confronted with. And I guess it's communication, isn't it, between the three worlds: the art world, the maritime world, and the very high net worth world, which represents the owner and may be the owner. So fascinating. I'm going to change the subject now, and I'm going to ask ask Paul. I wonder if you'd like to tell us about Arius, your technology, and how it's relevant to the art insurance industry.
Yeah,
Welcome,
thank you, David.
Paul.
And well, thank you. And, you know, I appreciate being asked to participate in this, and welcome to everybody that's on the webinar. I see we're from all over the world. I'm happily sitting in Vancouver here. It's relatively early in the morning. So you know, we would be an example of where technology and art is intersecting. Our company manufactures a 3D color laser scanning system that is quite unique. It's unique in that it measures both the surface of the painting geometrically as well as the color at the same time. And one of the unique aspects is the level of resolution. We're able to measure the surface down to 10 microns, which, to put it in context, is about the 10th of a human hair. In other words, the scanner sees what's on the surface at a level of resolution that the eye cannot detect. And if you look at the genesis, which is quite interesting, because this is an example of a technology that was specifically invented and designed for the art industry. The invention came out of actually the Canadian Government Labs, National Council of Canada, Research Council of Canada, to participate in the project with the Louvre on a forensic analysis of the Mona Lisa. And this particular project was looking at the warping, particularly, that was going on. And with the scanner data, they were able to do a lot of condition analysis on the Mona Lisa. You know, probably one of the world's most precious works of art. And so, you know, really, if you look at that project and the scanner's capability, it's all about the data. It's all about the data's capability of doing analytics to understand what's happening with the painting and project what could be happening with the painting in the future. So we acquired the technology from the Canadian government, and we have commercialized it in partnership with some of the museums that you mentioned earlier. So we were busy working on the data aspect, and we got a call from Canon. And like any technologies, there sometimes you get two technologies that intersect. And in this case, Canon was working on an elevated printer, which interestingly could print down to the same resolution that the scanner could measure, down at the 10 microns. So in other words, if we measure a micro crack on a paint surface and the brushwork, then Canon is able to print it at the same level of resolution. And I just want to point out to the audience, if you look at Pandora, you'll see in the background there is a goldfinch. Well, that has not been loaned to Pandora from the museum. That indeed is a replica, and how close the replica is, the reproduction. When we the first one we did was actually a Van Gogh Iris, which we did with the National Gallery of Canada. And when we brought it to the museum, the curator looked at the original and the reproduction beside each other and said, "Oh my God, I don't know if I know by looking at it which is which." Because you can imagine if it's a canvas and we're measuring the surface, we can actually measure the canvas weave, and Canon can print it. So there was a data aspect, which was really what drove the technology, and all of a sudden along came the printing capability that fit like a hand in a glove.
Absolutely fascinating. And certainly, you know, I was somewhat dubious about Pandora's work behind her, but now you've explained it. So actually, though, this technology which enables you to pretty much replicate artworks accurately, I guess in one sense, it has an advantage, because an owner of a super yacht, for example, or indeed of any other entity, may be able to replicate a work of art that would give him, which would give the same impression without it necessarily being the original. But do you think that you would feel there might be a danger of works developed under such a very specific technology actually being passed off as genuine?
That's a great question, because obviously it does look the same under lighting and in a frame. But you know, while you may see canvas in the print, if you actually touched it and tapped on it, you would find quite immediately that it's actually a hard surface. In fact, all you would need to do is look at the back or take it to the frame, and you would discover it's printed on aluminum. So I don't think there's any, unless somebody doesn't actually look closely at it, there's not going to be that issue.
Well, that's a relief, I guess. I just worry about you if you start on poplar wood as your backdrop or something.
Yeah, but look at the back. Yeah,
you always look at the back. I guess that's wise. Okay, well, you heard it here. You heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. Now, Manoj, you've got some interesting operations here, and I'm looking at your dashboard. Would you like to sort of tell us what tools are available to help collectors and owners assess this risk prior to speaking with a framer, a conservator, or indeed an underwriter or insurer?
Yes, so what you can see in the diagram is a snapshot of the dashboard that we just released a few months ago, in fact, where normally if you have sensorial data like temperature, humidity, or light, you just get a number. Okay, 21 degrees C, for example. What we've done with the dashboard is link that number to the material sensitivity of the objects. So the reason we did that is because if you shine 400 lux on, let's say, an unpainted stone sculpture, generally that will be considered low risk. But that same amount of light on a silk antiquity, for example, could fade it in a matter of weeks or even a matter of days if it's strong enough. So in order to really turn that data into actually useful information, you need to have context. And so when you go onto the ArtRatio dashboard, the first thing we ask you is, what are the materials on the object? And secondly, you type in the current temperature, humidity, and light levels. And just from that information, we can lift out a whole bunch of information regarding the risk. So from the knowledge of the materials, we know the maxima and minima, which are generally recommended. So where do we get that from? We get it from the same British Standards Institute document that I mentioned before, PAS 198. And so you can see the color-coded dials where the pointer for temperature is pointing in the green section, which means it's safe. Same for humidity, same for illuminance or light. But you can see that the exposure level is off the grid. It's way off the red. And that is because of the exhibition time. So that's another one of the questions that we ask on the ArtRatio dashboard, which is what amount of time is the object actually being exposed to light? And from there we can lift out exposure. We also try to lift out an index of photopic visibility, because it's as equal to have enough light bouncing off the object into the user's eyes that you can actually discern the colors and the details. And we can only do that when our eyes are operating in photopic visibility. In order to do that, we need to have enough light actually coming into the human eye. And on the basis of all of those parameters, we have applied them into our own proprietary algorithm. And from that, we lift out an estimation of the risk of gradual damage to that object based on the conditions under which you are exhibiting those items. So this tool is free. It's online. Anybody can go on to artratio.co.uk/dashboard and use it. And I'm hoping that it's going to provide a lot of value, potentially to insurers who want to direct their clients to use this tool. And from that, they should have an indication of the level of risk of gradual damage, even though we know gradual damage is not insured, but of course it can impact the market value of the item. I believe it's in the interests of collectors and insurance industry to protect the market value of those items.
I mean, obviously that's absolutely fascinating, because gradual damage isn't, as you say, you're quite right, it isn't exactly an insured peril, but it does degrade the value of fine art. So obviously that is of serious concern to owners and owners of the works and gallery owners and indeed those who operate super yachts. So your dashboard does work in terms of the medium and in terms of the various risk factors in which it's exposed to. So presumably there would be an algorithm which would take into account that the item is on board a super yacht, perhaps, in a humid area, in a saltwater environment.
Well, it's only things that you can measure. So until we were to measure vibration, for example, we wouldn't know under what kind of risk, mechanical risk, it was being exhibited. But we do know the temperature, humidity, and light to start off with. But later on into the dashboard, we'll incorporate more sensorial variables, and as we do that, the accuracy of our risk estimate should increase.
Well, something of great interest to insurers. And indeed to indeed to owners. So, how do you find that ArtRatio helps collectors to minimise? I mean, you've more or less said it, and you've got the products here, which just popped up on the screen. Would you just like to go through how your products might minimise the risk we've just been discussing?
Yeah, so we started about 12 years ago making display vitrines using Smartglass, which is a type of glass which can change its transparency when you apply an electrical signal. We hook it up to a proximity sensor, so when you approach, for example, the table, which is on the top left of the image, the glass will become transparent and the LEDs, internal LEDs, will go on. And so that will then you get a spectacular presentation of the object. And when you walk away, the sensor notes there's nobody there and switches off the glass and switches off the LEDs. So most of the time, we expect that these objects will actually be sitting in complete darkness. And they're being protected from UV, they're being protected from infrared, and they're being protected, obviously, from visible light. So you can see different form factors that we have. We have wall hangable frames, we have vertical display cases, we have table formats. And in each of these products, we have a system, which is a real-time control system, which measures in real time all of the variables that I mentioned before. So temperature, humidity, and light. It reads the information. It also asks the user the same information that you get on the dashboard, which is what are the material sensitivities of the objects on display. And as a function of all of this information, it can then lift out a real-time index of risk of gradual damage. Now, this is obviously quite a few steps ahead of the dashboard, because we're actually getting real-time information, and it's accurate because it's in direct proximity to the work of art. We can push all this information out to the cloud for further post-processing, and that leads on to a number of different analytical functions that we offer within our tool, within our product.
Okay, well that's very interesting, and I've seen the amazing black box on the table suddenly lighting up and revealing something absolutely fascinating. And of course, on board a vessel, the protection from light, which you highlighted earlier on in your presentation, and the protection from physical vibration and damage, and even super yachts can sometimes roll and pitch, and nasty things can happen, is very good. So your products not only protect the object from physical damage, but also from overexposure to light as well. So that's very interesting. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm just going to remind everybody that at the foot of your screen, you should have a function saying ask a question. And please, any of you, feel free to fire away, and we will do our best either to run screaming from the room or to address questions that you have. So Paul, coming back to you, your technology is of huge interest, and how would you assist the industry in reducing the cost of underwriting through either obviously risk mitigation in the first place, or in the event of a claim?
So I'll answer the first one. Risk management. Obviously, Menage's technology reduces the risk to the painting, and we all know that the owners of these super yachts are big, passionate collectors. Those paintings are passionate. They want it nearby. They want to enjoy that art. That's one of the reasons they end up on those yachts. But the opportunity, I think, from a risk management is a lot of those owners are not necessarily on the yacht all the time. In fact, a lot of yacht owners and the collectors are quite often only on the yacht maybe a few days or weeks a year, and the rest of the time we would suggest that maybe they would want to take the original off the wall and put a reproduction up, and when their guests come that they know they have the goldfinch, they would see the goldfinch and would probably assume it is the original one. Obviously, from the insurance perspective, the best thing for a high valued work of art is to remove it completely from the environment, put the reproduction up, and store the original in a secure, climate controlled facility such as Crozier. So that really is a on the risk mitigation side. On the claim side, it's really then about the data, what I was talking about earlier when we were doing the project with the Mona Lisa. If you think about that data, it's really a digital fingerprint of the current condition of that painting, the surface, the physical characteristics. And the best analogy I could use, it's the digital, we call it a digital master file. And it's analogous to a digital master file in the music and the film industry, which are stored in digital content repositories by companies like Iron Mountain. And the opportunity is if we've scanned the painting, say before it's underwritten, we now have a condition at a point in time, and let's say 3 or 4 or 5 years later, there's a claim on that painting, and if it's a $50 million painting and the claim is going to be a $10 million or $5 million, that's a big number to bite off. So one of the first things I would suggest is because the claims adjusting could be a subjective process, is we could scan it again. And when we scan it again, we have the ability of comparing down to the 10 micron level, the original scan that was done before underwriting, and then the painting that's now claimed to be damaged. So we can determine a couple things. We can determine, is this new damage or was it already there? Number 2, is this physical damage or is it damage as a result of degradation? And we were able then to help with the claims adjusting process by removing subjectivity, because it becomes very objective because you have scientific data. Another example would be fraud. So, there's been lots of news articles over the years about a painting being discovered has actually not the original, is a forgery. So if this painting that has been now under claim is determined to be a forgery, if it's exactly the same as it was before the underwriting, then it was a forgery at the beginning. So it's always a forgery. So, I think that's really where we add value, is to reduce the cost of underwriting by removing subjectivity from the process.
Well, it's a really valuable risk management tool, both in terms of the pre-existing work. I mean, some of the claims experts who are listening today, and I, back in my broking days, will agree that some of the biggest fights we ever had on fine art were the depreciation claims. So where you have an owner who says, oh, this has got a nasty scratch on this work of art and it's a total loss, and I want 100% of the sum insured. And then when you drill into it a little bit, I don't mean literally, you discover considerable volume of pre-existing damage, and then the negotiation starts. So to have the ability to have a logbook of the condition of a work of art throughout its experiences can be very valuable, just on its own terms. So yeah, I mean, this is very interesting indeed, and naturally, again, with the super yacht world, the potential to have an almost absolutely perfect, identical replica of a work of art on display on board the vessel when you have guests on board can also, I think, be quite valuable. It doesn't detract from any but the most stern connoisseur's experience, and of course it minimizes risk to the genuine work. So no, I mean, this is really one of the amazing technological functions that are going around at the moment. So thank you, Paul. Now, just a moment, Pandora. Turning to you. Yes, you're going to training here, and I wonder if you'd like to tell us how your training, especially in the context of the marine and super yacht industry, but also in more general terms, how does that help to minimize risk on board or indeed in transit?
Yeah, thank you, David. Well, we've got these 3 key areas in black up here on the slide, and so I look really at art management, and within this, of course, I do teach about risk mitigation strategies such as those offered by Manoj and Paul. That's why they're on the webinar, because it's such fantastic technology that you really can help to manage art nowadays. But obviously we talk about things within that, about the environment, as I've already mentioned, and logistics, and all sorts of aspects of the art that might be at risk, as I've mentioned. Then we also have art appreciation, and this really deals with the ignorance factor, because there are so many instances where art has been damaged, where people just didn't know what they're dealing with, as I mentioned before. And I'm not just talking about the stews and the interior crew, because we have had situations where exterior deckhands have just rugby thrown cushions into the interior in a haste to get to the pub once the guests have left, and knocked over a lamp that was worth 90,000 euros. And it was made of skin, and the chief stew had to overcome hell and high water to try and get it fixed, which she did because she was fantastic. So these are very, it's so important really that people just understand a little bit about art, the owner as the art collector, and a little bit about the art market and the art world, and what these materials are and media are that they're handling. But then to come on to the legal sanctions, this is so important too, because we have a number of areas where if you own an artwork, you can't just do what you want with it. There's all sorts of restrictions. So we had a situation, which everybody I think probably is aware of now, because it was big publicity, where sailing yacht Adix was arrested in Corsica. There was a multi-million-pound Picasso on board that was removed and taken away from the owner. It's now sitting in Madrid Museum, but quite often these things are just taken away and destroyed, or you don't see them again. And when I've heard of, you know, big objects just disappearing, so it's quite concerning. This is a national treasure law. Okay, so it's cultural heritage laws which prevent you taking certain important objects out of their territory. And in this case, it was a Spanish Picasso from Spain. Secondly, we have CITES and endangered species regulations, and this is a whole new area, and this has also affected super yachts. I mean, these are real things that are happening now. They're not sort of potential hazards. And there was a case where Damien Hirst painting with butterflies was removed when customs officers boarded, I can't remember which port, but I think it was a European port, because there were butterflies integral to the artwork, and they wanted to investigate to see if there was any endangered species issues. Now, quite often you can't expect a customs officer to be a zoologist, and even if they were, they wouldn't know all the 36,000 species that apply to artwork, decorative arts and sculpture on board. But they can cause huge problems, stopping the yacht in its itinerary, which if you're chartering a vessel at 650,000 euros a week and you can't go to your next beautiful place with your guests, I think we're going to have the event insurance people on us discussing that, because it's got a lot of consequences. So the CITES and the cultural heritage laws, and then we have a whole new regulation coming in, which is about cultural goods. And this is going to come into play in the next year or so. And this is about bringing cultural goods into the EU. So think of the EU as one country, Brexit notwithstanding, but I think in the UK, the idea is that we would follow these regulations. So you are going to have to make certain declarations and have certain paperwork for certain articles with criteria that would apply to this regulation. And failure to do so will again mean a prison sentence, as we've seen with the sailing yacht Adix. You will go to jail for fraud if you have misrepresented something on your documentation, and equally you would go to jail for smuggling if you smuggle something through the borders without it being properly documented. So these are quite important concerns. And then when we come on to insurance, I created a little insurance module for the crew with the help, shout out here to Jane Bide, who's on the webinar. Thank you, Jane. But I did create a little insurance module for the crew because I had my very first workshop in Palma. Someone came up to me afterwards, it was a super yacht captain, and he said, what happens if my stewardess puts her elbow into the canvas? I didn't know how to answer, because I was so gobsmacked that the captain of a vessel did not understand the insurance implications of objects on board. It was just, you know, stunned. I was stunned. And then secondly, I had a stewardess ask something very, very similar. So I created this just so that they can understand the types of perils, the levels and types of cover, what you get with a high net worth art policy, what to tell and when to tell your insurer that something of value is going to be moved on the vessel, and particularly about valuations and exclusions. What is excluded? If it has not been packed professionally, it's excluded from cover. If someone has come onto the vessel, I'm talking about things like, I talked about event-based risks, we talk about maintenance checks. Someone comes onto the vessel and it's not a forceful entry and they relieve that vessel of a very valuable artwork, as has happened, then obviously you're probably not covered because there was no aspect of forceful entry, depending, of course, on the policy. So then finally, I've also now started to work with the insurance industry, and it was really fascinating being at IFASIC and doing these workshops. And I started to work with a couple of underwriters to look at the prop forms, the proposal forms, what sort of questions should be on there, and how do these risks differ from, the ordinary sorts of high net worth art policy risks that we would see on land. So looking for red flags and knowing the right questions to ask. And looking at understanding the gaps really between the high net worth policy and the hull and marine policy, and really just helping insurers understand that whole picture. And of course, as I said at the outset, looking at these types of risk mitigation strategies that Paul and Manoj and many, many others I have on my radar, what they offer.
So it's extremely valuable, I guess, because here, as we've discussed throughout this presentation, we have the convergence of two highly technical and highly specialist worlds. You do have that maritime world that insures and operates the super yachts. These are large vessels. These can be anything over 150 feet length overall. They can be the size of cross-channel ferries. They can be enormous. They can be really quite big ships. And that maritime factor is, of course, seriously interesting and seriously complicated. But of course, it takes no account of all the delicate risk management factors that apply to fine art, the delicacy, the potential for inherent vice, obviously the potential for theft or genuine accidental damage. And your story, Pandora, about the crew throwing cushions into a lounge and knocking a sculpture down and causing $90,000 worth of damage. So it's all about increasing awareness, both in the art world of the maritime world and in the maritime world of the art world. So it's extremely interesting. And you do teach. You do have a sort of serious teaching aspect, and as you will see on the slide, we are going to run a workshop in London on the 30th of October on best practice and due diligence in managing risk, and that is not by any means restricted to the fine art world. We would like to see some salty sea dogs and some insurers to come along as well, because it's valuable for all of us. But Pandora, before you disappear, I'm going to ask you just a question that has been scratching on my head. You're in a yacht. You're at sea. You're 3 days from any port. What advice would you give to the crew? Remember, they're not fine art specialists. What advice would you give to the crew to stabilize and prevent damages getting worse than has already occurred from whatever's happened? And have you got any golden rules that you might suggest? And indeed, any of the panelists might like to jump in after that as well.
Well, the first thing I would say was don't try and do anything. So don't touch it and get it into a sort of secure, safe environment if you can. I mean, there was a situation where an Anish Kapoor mirror sculpture, incredibly valuable, got damaged by someone's thumb on the mirrored surface, and they tried to fix it, and it caused twice as much damage. And getting these things back to the artist studio to get them fixed, you don't need to I don't need me to tell you how much this costs. It's phenomenal. It's, you know, tens of thousands of euros. So don't touch it. There can be issues with putting things down in the hold because they can pick up spores. So you have to get it into a safe place. Obviously call me, I would say that, wouldn't I? But call me and send pictures. And again, this can be an issue because I did have exactly this case with a stewardess who I had trained, who got put in charge of the art on her vessel, and she wasn't allowed to send me pictures. So that was, you know, a bit of a strange thing, but obviously there's a lot of privacy as to what goes on to these vessels. But we really then have to look at getting it to a safe place, so getting it to a safe port, into a storage facility which has good climate control, where a conservator can come down to try to attend to it, and hopefully not have to send it back to the artist's studio, but to be able to deal with it in situ to a certain extent. So those would be my key bits of advice, really.
Okay, well, yes, and thank you. I mean, I think much of that would be extremely useful, you know, and keep the thing as.
We've lost David.
No.
Hopefully he will come back.
So otherwise, Pandora, maybe you want to wrap up?
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for coming. I don't know if anyone has got any questions. Do we have time for questions, Manoj?
We do, but we don't seem to have any questions at the moment.
No?
Yeah, we've been answering them as they've been coming up, actually.
That's true.
So suffice to say, really, thank you to all our panelists. I think this has been a really, really important session. We've delivered some really pertinent content to you, whether you're in marine or fine art, whether you're a broker, an adjuster, or an underwriter. And I would just like to say, obviously, we do have this day coming up on the 30th of October, COVID notwithstanding. I hope we're going to be able to do this, and obviously in a clean and socially distanced environment. But failing that, we will look to do this training online or to shelve it until we know what the situation is. And we will be looking at how these issues are very, very pertinent to insurers. So we'll be looking at, you know, all the sort of knowledge aspect, all the environmental risks, art appreciation, logistics. And we hope to have a visit to a sculptor's studio as well. Again, COVID and distancing notwithstanding, but we normally do that with my training as well when we handle it in London. So I think I'm trying to see if David's coming back to say goodbye to us.
I hope so. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're there.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know quite what happened there. I disappeared, and I seem, according to my picture, I've turned into a frog as well. But anyway,
up.
but no, thank you very much, Pandora, for completely seamlessly taking over in a moment of slight disaster. But yes, I mean, I think we've had an excellent discussion. I've much enjoyed it, and I've learned lots, and I do hope that you, ladies and gentlemen, have had a pleasant, interesting reintroduction to the market. I hope that the speakers on our panel have been interesting, and I hope that it's raised some questions and some thoughts that you might like to share with colleagues throughout the world and throughout the market. And so I'd like to say thank you very much for all of your contributions, to Manoj, to Pandora, and to Paul. I think we've had a really, really interesting discussion, and I'd like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending and for your interest. We do look forward to hearing from you. Please do get in touch with any feedback, any comments, any interest that you may have in future training, or just to get in touch with us individually or jointly. And thank you very much. It's been a great afternoon, and have a very pleasant evening. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for great moderation.
Thank you, David. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
special guests here.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Right.